So we've had the assignment early on where we discussed religion and morality, um, where I asked you to kind of define each of those and think through, what they mean and how they relate. In fact, just about everybody did well at that. If you missed some points on that, it was because you forgot to. Usually, it was because you forgot to tell me how they relate to each other. Um, and there's a lot of, some people had some sort of original or kind of slightly different approaches that were good, but most people frequently it's because of our culture. This is kind of what we're taught. This is what we kind of drink in from from early on in our schooling. Religion is this sort of you kind of choose a religion. Which we don't have a lot of time to go into this, but something that to think about. If you read the Narratives article by Christian Smith, um, one of the things that's often talked about in sociology and in religious studies, even in some philosophy courses, there's actually a man named Charles Taylor who has a book, The Secular Age, and it's this idea that really the possibility of my apologies for that on the screen. The possibility of sort of choosing a religion um, is, or choosing no religion in some sense, is sort of a modern thing. Now, there have been cosmopolitan empires where you could have a variety of religions, but usually there's some required state religion to go along with it. If you look at ancient Rome, there were myriads of religions and lots of you know people weren't usually criticized for taking up different religions, different kind of gods, as long as you also worshipped the state gods and the local gods, the family gods. You could do whatever else you wanted religiously. Um, Early Christians were persecuted because of the sort of requirement to have only the one God, that Jesus Christ was Lord and God, and there was no other. And so you couldn't worship Caesar, you couldn't worship other state gods, and that was seen as the problem. But historically, even if there was some choice of religion, you had to, at least in some sort of nominal sense, recognize the state religion. In the modern world, there's something called the heretical imperative, where we look, not all of us, but societally speaking, there's a sort of tendency to look down on, well, you just have that religion because that's what your family's always said, that's what your family's always done. Um, the heretical imperative is this idea that you should decide those questions for yourself, and everybody should. And if you want to be sort of talk about moral, to have a moral religion is to choose your religion based on your reason. Um, the idea of inheriting a tradition and living according to it is looked down upon oftentimes in our culture. So a lot of the definitions of religion that we got reflected that kind of modern tendency. At the same time, um, you know, morality, there is this tendency, even after all the discussion of objective morality, there's just this tendency to discuss morality as a sort of personal choice based on personal values. There again, this sort of certain level of the heretical imperative. Um, you're not really moral unless you're choosing it for yourself, and that you should hopefully hear some echoes of Immanuel Kant in that, because he has greatly impacted our thinking on both of those, right? But in this unit, we're really going to look at several things, and I want to contrast a sort of common tendency among a certain strain, what we'll call the virtue or wisdom strain of religious traditions, that they share in common with with Plato, with Socrates' ideas in the dialogues of Plato. And also, I want to look at what oftentimes we think of as the relation between religion and morality. Um, Near the end of part two or the beginning of part three, I can't remember where it falls, we'll look at atheist writer Sam Harris, right? And he absolutely hates religion, thinks religion itself is sort of immoral because he thinks that, religious moral people don't really get their morals from the religion, he thinks. They just import their morals into the religion and they explain away the bad parts, what he considers the bad parts of their religion. Um, that's sort of his take on it. We'll get to that when we get to him. But there's a tendency in the modern world to see religious morals as sort of suspect, right? Your morals should be based on your values, your shared kind of societal values. They should be based on some kind of secular, non-religious standards, if you're going to say they're objective at all. And so that's what we were looking at with all those different sort of approaches, the utilitarianism, the egoism, deontological ethics, those types of approaches to how is it that we do ethics, how is it that we do morality in the modern world. There's that effort to divorce it from religion. Frequently, that effort to divorce it from religion is because there's this idea that all religious morals is that you get a bunch of rules, right? And we talked a little bit in the last lecture. I talked a little bit about the relationship of rules to the sort of virtue tradition, which we're going to be looking at more fully now, the contrast. So we talked about those modern approaches to morality, and we looked at some of their weaknesses and the troubles of being consistently, there's sort of logical inconsistencies within those, utilitarianism, egoism, deontological ethics. They all have their struggles to ground morality. But oftentimes the criticism of religious morality is that, well, it's just capricious. It's just God says it. There's a list of rules that come from God. How do you know they come from God? What Sam Harris I mentioned is going to say is that, well, you're religious people. You don't, you ignore some of the ancient rules that you don't like anymore, and you just kind of pretend like they aren't there, and you bring your own more modern morality into your understanding of the religion. That's a really kind of shallow approach to it, and we'll talk about that, like I said, when we get to him. But what I do want to look at is something that we see in Solzhenitsyn, something that we see in the connection to Plato and the dialogues where Socrates is talking about religion and about justice and the gods and the kind of the meaning of life, these issues. And if you remember Socrates, like he has a sense in which there's no fear of death. He thinks it's illogical to fear death if you're a just person. He seems to think that there is a last judgment. He talks about how the gods are just. And we're going to look at a dialogue this time, the Euthyphro, where he critiques the gods of the state, the gods of Athens, the religion of Athens, the sort of mythologies of Homer's, Iliad and Odyssey. But he understands, right, that nature is sort of the law of reality. The law of human nature is built in. It's part of the design of what it is to be human, and it sort of is it has a pursuit of justice, right? Justice is part of the health of the soul. This is what's important. And so you see him in the Apology where, and taken along with the Crito, where on the one hand he submits to the ruling of the city. He doesn't want to rebel against the city, but in the other sense he is the gadfly. He is willing to take a punishment to do what is right, because he's convinced that it's better to suffer injustice than to do it. He believes that there is a basic morality, and one of the things that we're going to look at, I'm going to talk to you about more, is his approach and his understanding of the way religion and morality relate. So we're going to look at two aspects of that. One of those key aspects, what I want you to see is what not every religion and not every expression of every religion clearly has this idea. But what we saw in the Solzhenitsyn lecture that hopefully you've read, watched, listened to, is something that echoes with the things that Socrates is saying in Plato's dialogues, right? And this is the idea that Socrates doesn't have much confidence in the structures of law giving, because what does he value? What he wants, his sort of his calling, his vocation, to be the gadfly. The point is that what does it take to have a just society? Well, if you want a just society, then you need just people. And so he believes that it's his sort of calling to question his neighbors and friends and other citizens of Athens, to kind of prod them on to be just people. Because as we saw when I talked a little bit about in the Republic, we didn't read the Republic, but I talked about how in the Republic, Socrates has this idea of the small, simple life in the simple town where people they fulfill their vocation, they do their jobs, their tasks, they live by their skills, they live in sort of satisfied and self-controlled, inwardly content. Not like, in contrast to Callicles and the Gorgias, right? Callicles is like, create desire more, become like the tyrant, get as much as you can, right? Fulfill all your desires. That's what it is to be human. And Socrates is saying, no. To be human is to be temperate, is to be self-controlled, is to recognize that there is a certain need for justice, a reality of justice built into the fabric of the world, and you should seek to live in line with that as individuals. And if people will be temperate and self-controlled and live in line with that reality of justice, then you will have a just society. And so what we see in our culture oftentimes is sort of this approach to, everybody talks about, you need the rule of law. If you ever, if you observe our politics, right, what do both sides constantly complain about the other side doing? The other side doesn't care about the rule of law. Biden and Harris are corrupt. Biden's son is a corrupt, horrible, drug addict, drug dealer, selling, American favors, selling proximity to the vice president when Biden was vice president. Harris has all this corruption in the past. And then you get to the other side where they're saying Trump doesn't obey the rule of law, and the rule of law, right? Nobody's obeying the rule of law, and everybody's appealing to the rule of law. But kind of like in Socrates' day, nobody wants to hold themselves to the idea of a temperate life, a self-controlled life, a judicious and just life. And so there's this constant conflict between my rights and the common good, so-called, right? But and that conflict is to be dealt with, through laws, through acts, through judges. But Socrates, and oftentimes the sort of virtue, wisdom, religious tradition that we'll look at, right? The commonalities are more like in the Crito. You have to understand that the society and the laws are connected on a deep personal level, like family, right? That it's not just about, it's not the Thomas Hobbes. Human nature is the law of every man at a war against every other man, right? Every human is at war with each other. No, part of the goal of life for Socrates is friendship and fellowship with other humans, which happens in the context of justice, friendship and fellowship with the gods, which happens in the context of piety, which involves justice on some level. And so human nature isn't about individual rights as opposed to the common good. It's about how human existence is valuable, and you thrive as a human, you flourish as a human when you're in right relationship to other humans. You're in community, you share. I don't mean in a socialist communist sense. I mean in the sense of, if you ever read The Republic, his ideal city is where everybody does their thing and treats each other fairly and justly, and treats each other's property with justice, and lives a simple life that's self-controlled and temperate, right? And so what we saw in the Solzhenitsyn lecture, right, is he's criticizing the rule of law. Now, he states from early on that he came from living under, communist USSR back in the 60s, 70s, or really starting in World War II. Hopefully you read the biography, the brief biography, the Wikipedia link on Solzhenitsyn to understand who he is and why he's giving this talk. That you the commencement address that you saw, right? Why did they choose him? Well, he was a famous writer who became a hero during the Cold War to Americans because he resisted the harsh Stalinist communist government of his day, and he did so through writing, through speaking, and the willingness to be imprisoned for it. His ideas were that you don't participate in the lies, that if each person will act with virtue and speak truth, that's how you begin to destroy the corruption of the government. That's how you begin to take the power away from groups like the communists in the USSR, and how you take people like Stalin. How you take their power is you are a virtuous, self-controlled, truthful person, and you're not fearful of what can be done to you physically, right? You sort of trust to justice, and you trust to temperance, and to having a virtuous soul, a healthy soul, even if it costs you physically or financially, right? So that's the virtue, that's the basics of sort of the virtue wisdom tradition that I want to talk about. However, I mentioned before things like pornography and psychedelics, and we talked about how reality affects what you think is right or wrong, right? These things relate to. We talked about the what is right, what is wrong, how does it affect what you see, what you think you see, how you react to that with psychedelics. But we talked about this idea of what is good is rooted in what you believe is real, right? This is the thing we keep coming back to. Your grounding for morality is based on your understanding of what is real. And so when we talk about pornography and the rule of law, the first time I ever taught this class, the reason I always bring this specific issue up, I don't delve into a lot of specific issues, but one of the students in the class said, "I don't see why it matters. If everybody's consenting adults, why should you care if I look at pornography or not? What's it to you? How is it hurting you? Right? What's the problem? It's my individual rights. It's what I like. If the person gets money for it and they like getting the money for it and they don't care, they're a consenting adult. I'm a consenting adult. Why do you busybodies want to pass a law about that?" Right? And there are issues of the rule of law and pornography, or the rule of law and psychedelic drugs. Why is it that a psychiatrist can lead you on a spirit quest with a psychedelic drug, but a Native American medicine man can't lead you on a psychedelic quest with peyote in certain places? The medical license, the rule, is that the rule of law? Why are those two? Does that fix the issue? When you talk about the rule of law and you talk about pornography, right? Is it just to protect potential harm to people? What if there are all kinds of issues, rule of law issues around pornography, but you can't actually fix all the issues of pornography merely by the rule of law, any more than you can fix all the other issues in society merely by the rule of law. And this is what Solzhenitsyn is getting at, right? Now he says, again, I mentioned, he came out of this society in the USSR under Stalin, And he says what we had was chaos because there was really no rule of law. There was just a tyrant. And in fact, his understanding of tyranny, um, you know, he gives great reflection on things that Socrates would have to say about the tyranny in his discussion with Callicles and Paulus in the Gorgias. Because he saw it under Stalin, right? No one could have peace. No one could have camaraderie. No one could have fellowship. No one could have stability because there was no justice, because there was no rule of law. There was just the whims of the tyrant, and that's a horrible society. And Solzhenitsyn says, I'm not telling you that I think that society is better than what you are, America, but he's critiquing a rule of law that lacks a core moral fiber at its heart that's nothing more than a legalistic society, right? So it's just the rules. Because if you have just the rules, then people can get around the rules. People can legally get around the rules, right? You have a good enough lawyer. I've one of my side jobs. I work with a film company making films. I've produced and directed some. One that I did was on a prison minister, and in that discussion, he worked on death row. And one of the people talking about him was talking about death row, and he said, "I've never seen a rich man on death row. Why is that?" Right? Well, because in a legalistic society, yes, you have the rule of law, but the rule of law often bends to the controls of money. Whoever can buy the best lawyer gets the best outcome. And this is the type of thing that Solzhenitsyn is criticizing when he criticizes American culture. Everybody had him come make this, they plan to have him come make this speech for a commencement address at Harvard because, hey, he's his hero. He speaks out against the horrors of communism and the Soviet Union and Stalin. And so he comes to speak at a commencement address in the U.S., and he doesn't speak about those horrors. Instead, he speaks about the problem of a legalistic society. And that critique is rooted in some ideas that I think reflect Socrates, and we will see reflected also in relation to those aspects of religious traditions that I would call the wisdom or virtue traditions that are also reflected in Socrates, that relate to Socrates, that the places at which many of the major religious traditions have a sort of shared core. Now, in saying that, I don't mean to say that all religions are the same. I don't believe that. I don't think it's a fair treatment of any religion. I think if you look honestly and seriously at the religions, you'll recognize that there are major and huge differences, and we'll talk about those before the end of part 2 of this course. But there is a sort of shared reality, a sort of shared understanding of the sort of virtue wisdom tradition that is reflected in Socrates, in the dialogues that we've read. It's reflected in Solzhenitsyn. So there's this quote here from the lecture, right? 200 or even 50 years ago, it would have seemed quite impossible in America that an individual could be granted boundless freedom simply for the satisfaction of his instincts or whims. What does he say? He's not saying that freedom was never important in America. He's not saying there were no libertines in America. He's not saying 200 years ago everybody was better, there was no evil. What he's talking about is ideas that were core to our thinking. When we think of liberty in the modern and postmodern context, we think very individualistically. How dare you say anything to criticize me? That's my liberty. You hurt my feelings. You criticize my lifestyle. That's violence. That's wrong. You shouldn't do that. I'm free to do whatever I want. My freedoms are boundless. That's whatever I feel like I should be able to do. That's not what our the kind of founding fathers, for all their problems, for all their failures, their underlying ideal was that you have individual liberty that protects your goals, but they understood that as existing in a context of responsibility, right? So there's the story of Ben Franklin comes out of the Constitutional Conference, and some woman says, or maybe it was a news reporter, I can't remember, says, you know, Mr. Franklin, what kind of government have you given us? And he says, a republic if you can keep it, right? Or I think this is John Adams' quote that says, this government can only last for a moral and religious people, right? The understanding was there are certain, for a free society to exist, the founding fathers, for whatever political, social, legal failures they had, moral failures they had an understanding, much like what we see in Socrates and the religious traditions, that you can't really have a free or flourishing society if you don't have just people making up that society. If the people don't care to be inwardly just and good and noble and true people, then there's no amount of laws you can pass to keep them free. You're going to lose your freedoms. And so he says, subsequently, however, all such limitations were discarded everywhere in the West. A total liberation occurred from the moral heritage of Christian centuries, with their great reserves of mercy and sacrifice. State systems were becoming increasingly and totally materialistic. The West ended up by truly enforcing human rights, sometimes even excessively. But man's sense of responsibility to God and society grew dimmer and dimmer. In the past decades, the legalistically selfish aspect of Western approach and thinking has reached its final dimension, and the world wound up in a harsh spiritual crisis and a political impasse. All the glorified technological achievements of progress, including the conquest of outer space, do not redeem the 20th century's moral poverty, which no one could imagine even as late as the 19th century. What's he talking about, the 20th century's moral poverty? When he's talking about societal disunity, he's talking about Auschwitz. He's talking about the gulags in the USSR. He's talking about free societies cooperating with tyrants to maintain a certain order in foreign countries, to maintain their own financial interest, in order to buttress their own limitless freedoms, we might say, in a way that actually damages or enslaves others. So if you look at kind of post-colonialism, right, this sort of late 19th, early 20th century colonialism, and the way, supposedly free societies cooperated with tyrannical governments to maintain their own interests in foreign countries. Their own interest to kind of push individualized liberties among their population in a way that seemed to be boundless, but did so at great cost to other people. So you have all these issues that Solzhenitsyn is looking at, and it really echoes with what Socrates is saying. So, there's this sort of critique of the experts and the social scientists, the bureaucracy and tyranny. There's this idea of, if you watch the news, you have all these experts that tell you everything you're supposed to do and everything that's supposed to happen because they know, because the science, and half the time or more they get it wrong. And yet you see the same experts on the news, a year later, saying the exact opposite of what they said the year before, when they were wrong the year before, and they're still wrong. So you see in philosophy and ethics, Alasdair MacIntyre talks about, the sort of governance by social scientists, right? And social science is an inexact science, right? It's just nothing like physics or chemistry, or even biology, for all the nuances and variances between two, biological entities. There's at least similarity in system and structure. There are differences, but there's close similarity. Oftentimes in social science, something that's considered similar or considered to be a law is really, really kind of suspect, right? And we have in this sort of legal society, the rule of experts, the rule of social scientists, and you have like this bureaucracy. One philosopher, thinker, theologian has said, in the modern world, bureaucracy is the rule of no one, and it's experienced as tyranny, right? So, when you need something done and you can't get it done because of what that rule of law that Solzhenitsyn is talking about. Um, you have, I literally one time I bought a property, um, made it into a house, but trying to get the water bill in my name because um, over time, road names had changed, and in the paperwork, you know, they the water company said that my water meter was at an address that didn't exist. Uh, Even though they were sending it to my address, what I had bought, that did exist, even though I could stand in that front yard and look at the water meter and read them the meter number, the person couldn't change anything. I literally had to find a friend of a friend of a friend to break through the bureaucracy and get my water bill fixed, right? And that's frustrating. That's a tyranny. Nobody could do anything because they all had this government by rules. And then, so you have to find the person who knows somebody who knows somebody, right? Um, this is the sort of legalistic society that Solzhenitsyn is criticizing. That's just sort of the surface irritants of it. But he's going to the deeper elements of it, right? He says humanism, meaning non-religious humanism, in its development became more and more materialistic. It made itself increasingly accessible to speculation and manipulation by socialism and then by communism, so that Karl Marx was able to say that communism is naturalized humanism. So, Solzhenitsyn is criticizing Marx. For him, there's his experience in the gulags for nothing, right? Years in the gulags, seeing people die, put in the gulags. If you want to understand the way communism worked in the USSR and between like World War II and the 1970s, 80s, there's a great book called Symphonies for the City of the Dead. Incredible book. You should read. Everybody should read it. You see the sort of abuses and the tyranny of the communist society. It's supposedly for the common good. It's for humanism, but there's total manipulation, total control and tyranny, and a total lack of self-control. Solzhenitsyn is saying the West, even though it's not communist, is headed in the same direction. Because why? Because there's no inner control, there's no self-control, there's no temperance, there's no commitment to higher ideals. And so he says of Marx's statement, he said this statement turned out not to be entirely senseless. One does see the same stones in the foundations of a despiritualized humanism and of any type of socialism. Endless materialism, freedom from religion and religious responsibility, which under communist regimes reach the stage of anti-religious dictatorships, concentration on social structures with a seemingly scientific approach. This is typical of the Enlightenment in the 18th century and of Marxism. Not by coincidence, all of communism's meaningless pledges and oaths are about man with a capital M and his earthly happiness. At first glance, it seems an ugly parallel, common traits in the thinking and way of life of today's West and today's East. But such is the logic of materialistic development. What's Solzhenitsyn getting at? When you do away with spirit, when you make life all about physical, think about the conversation between Socrates and Callicles and Polus, right? About fulfilling desires, fulfilling, ambitions. They're all concerned with, food and drink and power, and Socrates is trying to critique that. He's criticizing that. Solzhenitsyn is doing the same thing, right? Materialism does not fulfill the nature of the human being. It rejects the spiritual aspect. And so materialistic humanism has trouble presenting people with a solid grounding for moral life. So the interrelationship is such, too, that the current of materialism, which is most to the left, always ends up by being stronger, more attractive, and victorious because it is more consistent. Humanism, without its Christian heritage, cannot resist such competition. We watch this process in the past centuries and especially in the past decades on a world scale as the situation becomes increasingly dramatic. Liberalism was inevitably displaced by radicalism. Radicalism had to surrender to socialism, and socialism could never resist communism. Solzhenitsyn is giving a warning to American thinkers in the 1970s and saying essentially, you think yourself better than the communists. The communists are horrible, but they've only gotten to where you're going faster than you're going there. That would be the way to sum this up. He's saying your rejection of the spiritual aspects by humanism, he means concern for the human being, that you should be concerned for others, for your fellow man, you should be humanitarian, you should care about human rights. Right? These are the values of humanism. And Solzhenitsyn is saying when you take away the sort of religious, spiritual underpinnings of Christian heritage from the West, because that would be the heritage that the West had, the idea of the Judeo-Christian idea that humans are made in the image of God. We hold these truths to be self-evident that all people are created equal. That idea, that's a sort of Judeo-Christian heritage underlying the idea of human rights and humanitarianism and all these things that we would value, equality and concern for the poor, all those things we value. As a society, he's saying when you take away the spiritual aspect, you impoverish yourself spiritually, that you end up heading in the same way as the sort of Stalinist communists. You're going to head eventually into a radicalism that gives way eventually to a brutal communist regime. Because all you have is the rule of law, because no one is encouraged to be self-governing. No one is given the tools to self-govern, right? He's basically claiming there must be a sort of spiritual religious heritage that gives you the strength and the tools to be self-governed and temperate. Only in being self-governed and temperate can you have an ordered society. A society that's merely ordered on the rule of law, in the most basic sense, Solzhenitsyn is saying can't last. That echoes with everything that Socrates has said so far in what we've read. And it echoes with a sort of a religious understanding. G.K. Chesterton is a early 20th century Catholic writer. He said, the truth is that it is only by believing in God that we can ever criticize the government. Once abolished the God, the government becomes the God. What's he saying? If you ever want to look at any kind of successful effort at a sort of stable revolution against a controlling government, if it's sort of godless, you're going to end up with brutality, right? With just absolute brutality, because the government becomes the God. It is the power. Power is everything. If you think about Callicles, maximum flow, and who has maximum flow? The people in control. The people in control. The people with power, with strength. The people in the know, the social scientists, whoever. They should be the ones in power. They should rule. They should govern. And if there's no God, if there's no spirituality, if there's no religion underpinning, how do you resist that sort of power? How does one individual person or a handful of individual people resist tyranny and the abuse of power? You see Socrates resisting corruption in society and being willing to resist a sort of abusive power, right? He's found guilty when he's not guilty of anything. He's put to death, but he has no fear. He's not worried about it. How can he go to that without fearing? Well, he goes to that without fearing because he has this understanding that there is justice built into the very nature of what it means to be human. And justice in relation to the gods is piety. The gods themselves are divine, which means they're perfect and they're just and they're good and they're true. And so if you're in line with that, then nothing that anyone can do to you at the end of the day matters. That's what Socrates is getting at in the Crito. That's what G.K. Chesterton is getting at here. This is part of the point of what Solzhenitsyn is saying in the lecture, in the kind of commencement address that you read or listened to. Right. So, actually, Chesterton is a writer that Solzhenitsyn loved and drew inspiration from. But if you take Solzhenitsyn's writings, what Chesterton is talking about here shows up in Solzhenitsyn's writing, his book called The Gulag Archipelago, which is a dense kind of doorstop of a book. I listened to it on Audible. It was very depressing. It's like I think nearly 60 hours. It was just a cataloging of the abuses of the communist regime in the USSR, right? Because his view is that this regime stays in power because it lies, because people cover up the truth. They don't tell what the regime has done to people. And so Solzhenitsyn, who had been put in the gulags, who had been persecuted, who had been arrested without any real reason, um, he's all about telling the truth, exposing the kind of the darkness to the light. But in the Gulag Archipelago, he tells a story of an older woman when the government was persecuting the Russian church, the Orthodox Church in Russia. The communist government would kill off bishops and then replace those bishops with their own bishops who were not even really Christians usually. They would just basically choose someone with an education, something to do with philosophy and religion, or maybe even not that, to go to be the priests and the bishops, to lead the church, because they essentially wanted to make the church an arm of the government. And so in the Gulag Archipelago, there's this story of an older woman who had actually hid one of the real bishops, one of the church-appointed bishops. And when the secret police came to her, she basically said, they were asking her about the bishop. She said to them, as Solzhenitsyn reports it in the Archipelago, he says, the woman said, "Yes, I know where my bishop is. I helped him along. No, I will not tell you where he is. He is the real bishop. What are you going to do to me? Are you going to kill me? I'll go to heaven. I'm not scared of you. You're more scared of each other than I am of you," she said. Right? Where do you get that kind of resolve, that sort of inner strength to resist a tyrannical government? Well, it comes from, in Solzhenitsyn's thinking, at least in G.K. Chesterton's thinking, it only comes with a sort of inner spiritual, religious understanding of a higher order, of a deeper and truer order than just what the government says. And so the question that Solzhenitsyn is raising on one hand is virtue possible apart from religion, apart from spiritual belief? Can you really be a virtuous person if you deny the sort of the spirit of humanity, of the human being, or even if you deny a God of some sort? Is it possible to really maintain virtue? That's excellence, flourishing in conduct under every circumstance, under every sort of pressure. The willingness to, as Socrates puts it, to think it's better to suffer an injustice than to commit one. To refuse to suffer an injustice, to refuse to commit an injustice, even if it's to save yourself from suffering, right? Is that kind of virtue possible apart from some sort of spiritual belief? That's one of the things that we consider, and that's what Solzhenitsyn is saying. The West has better laws than, when he says the East, he's talking about the communist regime in Russia. He's not talking about the Far East. So he's saying the West seems better than the East, but at the end of the day, their journey is headed in the same direction as Stalin's Russia. Because why? Because there's a total absence of any kind of spiritual reality. There's a total absence of sort of spiritual nourishment, of a sense of God. You've divorced yourself from everything that's part of your system religiously, and therefore the system can't stand. This is what Solzhenitsyn is getting at. And so we're going to look at that question some more as we look at the things that the religions hold in common. We look at some efforts to ground morality apart from in a human nature view, right? A sort of natural law that we'll talk about that more. That doesn't embrace a view of a natural law apart from a creator, a God, a relationship to spirituality and religion. Is that possible? Can that sort of natural law supply the sort of raw material and the grounding for a virtue ethic, for the things that we value, even, right? For the idea that it's better to suffer injustice than to commit it? Can you have that apart from sort of some spiritual religious belief or not? But before we dive into that and look at the wisdom and the virtue traditions within the religious context and the things that are similar to Socrates but in various religious expressions, I do want to look at one thing in Plato's dialogues that relates to an idea of maybe a religion that's not concerned with virtue. Now, most critics of religious morality, honestly, what they're criticizing does exist in some expressions of religion. Some religions lend themselves more freely to this expression than others, but it's the idea that God is powerful. God is power, in essence. What it is to be God is to be all-powerful. That's the point of being God, is you have all the power, and therefore, whatever God commands is good. And if he says don't murder today, but he says murder tomorrow, well then murder wasn't good yesterday and it's good today, right? That's the view. It's called divine, sort of radical divine command theory of ethics. The Euthyphro dilemma kind of deals with this, and we're going to talk about later to what degree. But we saw Socrates' understanding of nature, idea of a judgment, idea of potentially an afterlife, the idea of fulfilling your calling in relation to eternal principles, the need to be in communion with your fellow humans and with the gods, and that happens in justice and piety. But in the Euthyphro, we're going to see that Socrates is not ignorant of the difficulty of finding a solid, steady, logical, and consistent morality in relation to the gods, in relation to piety. And so that's, the Euthyphro is going to address that. It's also going to address this idea of divine command theory, of something is right because God says it's right, or it's wrong because God says it's wrong. And there are expressions of divine command theory in the various world religions that have some of the problems that we'll see in Euthyphro's expression of religion in the Euthyphro dialogue. So, moving ahead, I want you to read the Euthyphro and think about what's going on in it. You have some basic questions to answer and a short discussion point to consider, and then we'll look at the Euthyphro dilemma. But don't look up the Euthyphro dilemma. In fact, if you look up anything else on the Euthyphro, right? If you want to do extra reading on the Euthyphro, I would encourage you read the Euthyphro first and tell me what it's about as itself. Don't look it up first, because just about every modern critic and lecture writing about the Euthyphro, they constantly talk about the Euthyphro dilemma. That's something we're going to talk about, but I think there are problems with that being the main focus when you read the Euthyphro. And I'll get into why that is in another lecture. But we're going to move forward into the Euthyphro. This is a dialogue of Plato. Socrates it's the day before, or a couple of days before his court case, where he's called on a trial in the Apology. So it's happening a few days before what we read in the Crito. And he's going into court, and as he's going into court, a man named Euthyphro is coming out of the court. Like, both of them have pre-trial appointments. And it starts this discussion about Socrates is being put on trial, and the accusations have to do with his failing to honor the gods of the state in the way that, so it's a question of impiety and things like this. And so Socrates is asking Euthyphro questions, because Euthyphro is very, very religious in the most sort of conventional Athenian sense, in the most kind of superstitious sense in some ways. And you'll find that Socrates isn't anti-religious. In fact, Socrates in the Apology will say, I obviously believe in a God. I told you I do everything I do because a messenger has come to me from the God to have me do this. So Socrates is not denying God, nor is he denying justice in relation to God. He's critiquing what Euthyphro has to say about that. So this idea that there are religious expressions that aren't part of this wisdom virtue tradition that I want to talk about. That's something that I want to get out of the way first as we deal with the Euthyphro. And then in passing, we'll also talk about the Euthyphro dilemma, because everybody in the modern world who studies the Euthyphro studies the Euthyphro dilemma, and we'll talk about what that is. But read it, think it through, answer the basic content questions on it, and we'll dive into it more next time.